Hey, and welcome back, Groovy Sound Searchers, to the Old Newspaper Plus. I'm Courtney Lorraine, bringing you the old news. I want to start off today with an apology to my listeners. I noticed I've yet to introduce my apparent co-host. I'm positive everyone could hear her in the background of the last episode, because when I listened back, she was all I could hear. Her name is Bailey, but I call her Babe. She is my 4-year-old rescue dog. She's a black lab mix that weighs around 75 to 80 pounds, and she is the best and fattest little family companion anyone could ever ask for. And like it or not, she's always going to be with me when I record. I promise I will try my best to keep her snoring at a minimum. However, since it's white noise to me at this point, she's guaranteed to sneak it into the episodes every now and then, because I record in the morning and she's a lazy daisy who likes to sleep half the day. Now, let's get into some old news, shall we? In this episode, I'm reading about a home that, unlike Babe, really doesn't need an introduction. This home was opened to the public in 1923 after its mistress passed away. Before that, no one but a select number of workers, along with the owner and designer of the house, had been inside since it was purchased by said owner. It is one of the most well-known houses in America and has been for about 100 years, if not a little more, especially amongst crowds that enjoy the mysterious and the paranormal. Consisting of 160 rooms, just one shower, it's filled from top to bottom and inside and out with incredibly stunning details, none of which were intended for the living. In honor of spooky season, I'm reading about the home of Mrs. Sarah Winchester, heiress to the Winchester Arms Company. Both of these articles are a bit lengthy, so I'm going to jump right into them. And both of these publications are available on newspapers.com. Thank you. I pay for that subscription. This first article was originally published in the Austin American Statesman of Austin, Texas, USA, November 9th, 1924. And it reads, "How would you like to live in this house for homeless ghosts? A home in which every one of 160 rooms is designed to accommodate the spirits, and where departed souls may wander at will. Would you spend $5 million on a house for homeless ghosts? Perhaps you imagine that spirits that move in the darkness and having no substance or shape aren't really pining for an earthly domicile. Yet it was a spirit that directed the late Sarah L. Winchester, widow of the son of the founder of the famous firearms concern, to spend a fortune on the dwelling where departed souls may wander at will. The Winchester Mystery House near San Jose, California is the result. It is the largest private residence in the world, containing 160 rooms, goodness knows how many closets and cubbyholes, and it was in the process of building for more than 36 years. So as long as you continue to build, so long as you never entirely complete the dwelling, a specter is said to have told Miss Winchester, just so long you continue to live. And for more than a third of a century, a corps of 13 carpenters and artisans was constantly employed, building, tearing down, and reconstructing. Hammers and saws echoing always through the grotesque manse of spooks. In spite of the ghostly promise, not long ago, while the patchwork of rooms increased and 13 artisans and carpenters still kept up a determined clatter of tools, the twisted thread of the owner's life snapped, and the mystery house stood, a gigantic monument, fascinating, magnificent, incomplete. 40 years ago, death desolated the Winchester home, taking husband and child and leaving a heartbroken wife and mother. In fact, that $1,000 came to her daily from her royalties, and that her fortune was almost limitless, helped her not at all. That this fortune was derived from the manufacture and sales of weapons designed to kill tormented her. She tried to balance things by establishing charities. The Winchester Sanatorium for tubercular sufferers, at her early home in New Haven, Connecticut, being a conspicuous example of her benevolence. But nothing served to comfort her. "You shall have gold without stint," her husband said to her in the dear days before they were parted. "You shall build yourself a house, any kind of house that you desire." Out of all the conversations between them in their years they lived together, that one stayed with her. She came to think that he would be happier if she built that house, and she traveled far and wide to find a fitting site, arriving at length in San Jose, California, then a small town in the lovely Santa Clara Valley. One day, as she drove along Stevens Creek Road, she came upon a 30-acre lot in which a Dr. Caldwell was building himself an 18-room house. She stopped her carriage. Here was the home site of her dreams. She alighted, and she did not return to her equipage until she had persuaded the doctor to let her purchase the property. An ardent spiritualist, she communicated with the unseen realm, which she felt sure had guided her to her choice, and received the above astounding message to build the home for spirits. She retained the construction force employed by the doctor, but now no step was taken without the advice of the spirits. Rooms appeared of size and shape amazing to contemplate. Corridors and stairways were erected where no human need for them could be imagined. The architect threw up the job in disgust when he saw his careful plans discarded. The master carpenter was discharged when he refused to wreck and renew work he had painstakingly finished. Changes in personnel were rapid and varied. Mrs. Winchester became sole designer and absolute autocrat. Her rigid seclusion was subjected to severe tests some 20 years ago when Theodore Roosevelt, the President of the United States, visited the Santa Clara Valley, heard of the mystery house, and requested that the San Jose Chamber of Commerce, which was entertaining him, to arrange the visit with its mistress. Urgently, the Chamber of Commerce presented its case to the recluse who reigned over the house that had come to take on the aspect of a small city, but she haughtily declined to permit their illustrious guest to cross her threshold. Roosevelt, of course, enjoyed the joke of being excluded from an American home as much as anyone. The mystery house was built at first about a great central tower, but this was demolished in the earthquake of 1906. And now the huge dwelling rambles from one weirdly imagined room to another, so that the whole house may be traversed without passing through any room more than once, until the last three before the south entrance are reached. So intricate are the windings, the stairways, the corridors, and the oddly shaped chambers that even guides who now conduct the visitors through the mazes of mystery have to have arrows painted on the doors here and there in order to find their way out once inside. As the house spread from wing to wing, lands were added until Winchester Park now comprises an extensive acreage. But not alone for an extra space which to build did Miss Winchester desire the property she bought. Peace and solitude also spurred her on. Tall trees, palms, peppers, and live oaks, dense hedges, and an unscalable fence surrounded the parks and gardens that form a setting for the home of wandering spirits, and effectually shielded it from outside view. But today the forbidding iron gates and the gray graveled entrance stand ajar. The parks have become picnic groves, and guides conduct the curious through the mysterious mazes. To examine it all would require weeks. It has been estimated that if one spent a minute in each room, more than 2 hours and a half would be necessary to complete the tour. Exploration has only begun, for every day some new feature comes to light. The stairs are spooky things. Goofy, the guides call them. Steps 2.5 inches high with 18-inch treads and narrow casings. In one place, 45 of these stairs are negotiated to obtain the rise of 8 feet with 9 turns back and forth. In another, it takes 18 steps and 5 turns to reach a room 5 feet below. Many hallways are only 2 feet wide. All wood used is of the finest grown, not veneered but solid, with a polish that reflects like a mirror. The very hinges of doors are sometimes of silver and beautifully chased. The windows are of rare workmanship and staggering costs, some of the art glass windows being worth $1,000 each. Others are cut of glass inlaid with German silver. Windows on each side of the magnificent mantel are inscribed. Wide unclasp the tables of their thoughts. These thoughts people this little world. A view from one of the windows makes a visitor feel as though he looked out upon a foreign city, a city of towers and turrets, of belfries and gables, cupolas and spires. Yet it is all one house. Within this wilderness of rooms, where windows appear sometimes on walls, sometimes in ceilings, floors, chimneys, or a bit against blank partitions, doors open at unexpected places, occasionally from some upper chamber directly to outdoors, and then a sudden fall, sometimes to the roof, or to a closet so tiny that even a book cannot be shut inside. Open a heavy door, go up a metal-bound flight of stairs, turn, and come out into the same room you have just left. The white satin chamber, so called because the walls and ceilings were draped in that material, and even the floor covered with it, held central interest in the owner's lifetime, for it was here that she sought communication with her beloved husband. No one else entered it. During her last years, Miss Winchester used to be taken to this room for one of the elevators that led from the basement to the garret, wheeled to the door, and the nurse dismissed. After several hours of silence, she would ring for the nurse, who would find her outside the door with it locked. Unlike most of the rooms, this one had a single window, carefully curtained. Passerbys sometimes reported seeing the shadow of a woman on the curtain, but no one knows what transpired within. The blue room, or seance chamber, has a steel-barred windows and a capacious closet in which were kept numerous marvelously colored silken gowns, each of a hue appropriate to communication with a specific spirit, and worn when the ghostly counsel of that shade was desired. Prism Hall, the main entrance, is a masterpiece of silver and gold, with chandeliers of prisms so set that they make the hall a rainbow glory. The entrance doors of cut glass are valued at $2,000 and were never used. They swung open for the first and only time when the body of their mistress was carried out of them for her last journey to the city of the dead. Mrs. Winchester, her employees, and those few whom she saw in the course of business entered by a side stairway and used a reception room that seems peculiarly barren and uninviting. The ballroom, in which no carefree feet ever danced, has a great pipe organ of which no fingers ever drew any strains of gaiety. Fireproof safes and burglar-proof vaults hold treasures of gold and silver plates never banqueted from by merrymaking guests. There are electric and hydraulic elevators, wood, coal, and gas fireplaces, steam, hot air, and electric radiators, 47 mantels of brick, tile, brass, stone, wood, marble, and even glass. There are rooms floored with trapdoors. There are conservatories with no floors at all. Uncanny is the first section put up by its tireless builder. Shattered by the earthquake, it was never rebuilt, for Mrs. Winchester believed that the spirits had done the damage as a warning of displeasure, and the whole section was abandoned just as it stood after the earth shuddered. Embossed plasterings hangs from the ceiling in shreds. Beveled windows are broken, and dust covers the inlaid floors. Things run in mystical numbers in the mystery house: 13, 9, 7, and 3. There must be 13 doors to a room, for example, even if the last one is but a foot high and is squeezed in under a window. Bathrooms boast elaborately tiled walls, mosaic floors, ornamental ceilings, and cut glass windows. They contain the best of the modern tubs and fixtures, silver trimmed. They are not connected with the bedrooms, but are scattered hit or miss. So, with kitchen after kitchen, possessed of every conceivable convenience, labor-saving device, shining nickel, porcelain, and marble. Sinks are encountered everywhere, on stairs, in hallways, in closets. A room full of laundry tubs shows the innovating of corrugated sides so that no washboard is necessary. Mrs. Winchester's household consisted of a secretary, a maid, a housekeeper, and a caretaker and his wife, all white, and a mix of Oriental servants. No one was permitted to go about the house at will. For 26 years, the caretaker saw but 5 rooms except those in which he and his wife lived. The main portion of the 160 rooms designed for the accommodation for spirits. Each one a departed friend of the recluse, and each room was built in accord with the expressed desires of its ghostly tenant. So the story runs. The owner's faith in the message of life so long as she continued to build is shown by the materials left after her death, enough to prosecute the task for another 40 years. It fills 3 large storehouses and includes excellent stock that could not be replaced today at any price. And that ends the first article. And I'm probably going to include some images of this article on social media to accompany this episode because it has a really spooky picture of the house with a creepy specter figure on top of it. There's also a really small picture of the late Sarah Winchester as well. That's a bit haunting in my opinion. Personally, I would have been pissed if some newspaper would have printed up a picture of me like that after I died, to be honest. But maybe that's just me. I'm a little vain, so. By the way, if you just so happen to be unfamiliar with this location, I definitely recommend you go check it out. There's a website, winchestermysteryhouse.com. It's so awesome. It's got tons of pictures throughout the decades from all angles of outside of the house, and a few pictures of rooms from inside the house. You can go on tours of this house as well, and I believe one of the gardens, but you guys will have to go online and research all that stuff yourself because I'm, not trying to really plug for anybody, but this house is awesome. Also supposed to be pretty haunted if no one guessed. Sorry, I lost my spot. There's lots of documentaries and like TV show episodes and books and articles and podcasts that you can go check out that further explain hidden gems that were very specific to the architecture and to Sarah herself. Now I'm going to get into the second article. This one was published originally as a spoof piece, I believe, like a vintage tabloid or something. At least that's the vibe that I get when I'm reading it. This article was also written very shortly after Sarah passed away. We're talking just a couple months after, maybe at the most. And that at that time, people were still very confused about the house and its owner. So, and this article is actually from 2 years prior to the last article that you just heard. So just keep that in mind. It's a little earlier. It was originally published in the Oakland Tribune of Oakland, California, USA, October 29th, 1922. And it reads, The Spirit House of San Jose by John G. Robinson. How a mansion was built and torn down for 30 years in obedience to a woman's strange will. Stillness, broken only by fluttering to earth of fall leaves, today surrounds the mystic San Jose spirit home of the late Mrs. Sarah L. Winchester, capitalist, benefactress, and eccentric, the house that has taken 40 years to build. The rasping of the saw has been replaced by the song of a hummingbird and the methodical tap, tap of untiring hammers has given way to quiet. Mrs. Winchester is dead. But, contrary to the belief she had cherished for 30 years, death preceded the cessation of building activities upon her $1 million home, rather than following after. It was said that she believed she would die when the house was finished. She saw to it that it was never finished. Today, the vast crazy quilt mansion of 102 rooms and many hallways, builded upon the fantasies of an aged, wealthy recluse forever to be loved for her charities, is blanketed by a stranger silence than that which it has known for 30 years of its period of construction. And death has brought no revelations to the mysteries of the strange home, or the life of hers who built it. The great iron gates and the gray graveled entrance still stands closed. The foreboding hedges of cypress still stand guard around the forbidden grounds. Strange romance, strange philosophy, forming stories such as fiction has never told, live within, perhaps like Mrs. Sarah L. Winchester, never to be known. Resentment, too, lives within. Resentment in the heart of the faithful few who served the eccentric mistress. Again, the common gossip which they choose to call infamous lies. For these faithful servants, an infinitesimal handful of friends who knew Mrs. Winchester deny the age-old story that she believed that when she ceased the building of operations of her mansion, that death would come. Unfair to even guess the truth. Suffice to know that for 40 years the sounds of hammers and saws have clashed in inharmonious sounds as they built or tore down within the Winchester house. Suffice to know that for 40 years, a corps of working men numbering 22 has been at a constant labor in the great awkward ambling mansion of grotesque architecture. And now that Mrs. Winchester is gone, they too have gone. The proverbial search for a needle in a haystack is but a slight task compared with seeking to ferret out the mysteries of Sarah L. Winchester's hermetic existence in her lonely mansion home. True, she had servants. True, she had a feminine secretary who knew her every move. True, she had relatives. But from these can be gained scarcely more of an insight into Mrs. Winchester's life than can be gained from peering gawk-eyed through a tangle of cypress, bamboo, and other growth that framed the spirit house. A little strategic sleuthing, however, inevitably brings forth something. So it is that some of the tales of this millionaire woman's strange mansion and stranger life have been mined from elusive ore. 40 years ago, Sarah L. Winchester, whose millions came down the creation of Winchester Arms, purchased the 50-acre tract of land lying west of the city, and there established her home. Tragedy had entered her life, the story goes, death claiming first her husband and then her only child. Mrs. Winchester's grief was pathetic, and there are those who will tell you that therein lies the secret of her strange afterlife. Year followed upon year, but the clattering of construction never ceased. The great house grew in magnitude until, from its original huge 18 rooms, it increased to 102. Today, near either end stands unfinished rooms, mute evidence that even unto her death Mrs. Winchester had carried forward with her plans. In this great house there is no apparent adherence to design anywhere. Large windows, small windows, round windows, square windows, leaded windows, and windows of art glass are all in great conglomeration. Doors open in and out of the most unexpected places, some of them in the second story being such as to permit one to step into thin air should they be opened. Odd little porches, strange pergolas, scores of cupolas, and miles, it seems, of corridors, all from a part of this strange home. Before the great earthquake of 1906, a seven-story tower reared itself majestically above the straggling mansion, but was destroyed by the quake and was never rebuilded. Central interest in the Winchester Mansion, according to one who for 10 years was an occupant of the house, lies in what has ever been known as the White Satin Room. No one, save Mrs. Winchester, has, at least not prior to her death, had ever entered there. The room is said to be floored in white. The walls are immaculately white, the story goes, and as are the seats of spotless white satin. In this mystic room is only one window, always closely curtained. Across it in the days of old, it is said, the shadow of a woman's form sometimes passed, but that was all. Curious eyes never saw more, despite the fact that Mrs. Winchester repaired to the white satin room many, many times. The great doors to Prism Hall are never known to have been unlocked. The hall, 8 by 40 feet in size, was wainscoting of prisms solidly set so that no wood is visible, it said, there being thousands upon thousands of these prisms, so that one walking the length of the hall would find the maze of a scintillating brilliance and dazzling rainbow colors. The hall contains no furniture, 'tis said, excepting a few solid mahogany pedestals on which stand rare Italian marbles. Those who, in the 40 years of its existence, have entered the spirit house of Mrs. Sarah Winchester, including even her trusted secretary and employees, entered into a small reception room, barren and foreign to any hint of luxury, via an uncomfortable staircase to one side of the building. In this dingy room, the strange and wealthy woman greeted the few who came. The story is told that there she once greeted a nephew named Sprague, an would-be actor who sought her aid. She drafted him a check for $50,000 and bade him on his way. Such was her brevity of reception even to a relative. Fear of bodily harm, we're told by ones who should know, may have been the motive back of strange self-isolation of Mrs. Winchester. The story of a great fright sustained by the lady of the manor is told. Mrs. Winchester, many years ago, kept in a wine cellar of the great house quantities of the finest vintage of the land. One morning, as she entered the cellar, runs the tale, she was horrified by seeing before her on a clean surface of a furnace pipe the imprint of a black hand. Terrified, Mrs. Winchester is said to have fled the cellar, ordering the doors double padlocked forever. To this day, it is said the double padlocks still remain, now rusty with age, and the wine still within. One theory for the dominant fear in this widow's heart is advanced by a former friend who declares that to him, Mrs. Winchester oft remarked, "Because my income comes from rifles and ammunition that take life, I must be careful and must do much for humanity." Mrs. Winchester's charities are little known, but great in magnitude. Seldom did she aid in individuals, but her huge checks flooded out to accredited institutions, particularly the New Haven Tuberculosis Hospital. Returning to the tales of Mrs. Winchester's spirit house and the life she led, the main living room at the Winchester place is said to be a thing of beauty, with blue Antwerp hangings. Its oak floor is said to be covered deep with the fantastic rugs of the Orient. Oddly, in this living room are 2 large safes, the story tells us, one upon another. In these were kept the costly gold plate used upon the dining table every day by Mrs. Winchester, the servants having to lock the ware securely after every meal. Then, too, there is the music room, for Mrs. Winchester's heart is said to have been ever gladdened by the lilt of song or music. She is said to have played the piano herself. The music room is said to occupy the extreme southern end of the great ambling mansion, having walls and ceilings of stucco work beautifully frescoed by a famous mural painter. There was a significant grand piano, a splendid orchestral, phonographs, a pianola, and virtually every other kind of musical instrument there. Few ever played. At one time, we are told that Mrs. Winchester offered the Bostonians $20,000 to change their stage to stage their opera in her home for exclusive hearing, but impossibility of breaking their train schedule prevented the performers from accepting. A sumptuous tea room, too, exists. No tea was ever served there, it's said, but the room is exquisitely appointed, a thing of beauty. Mrs. Winchester never failed to have her afternoon cup of tea, but always, it's said, in the unpretentious little room upstairs where she transacted many of her business affairs, or out on the terrace of her beautiful garden. Gardens? Yes. The gardens of the Winchester home, with an additional great conservatories, are things of exquisite beauty and were the pride of this eccentric woman who lived within them. Mrs. Winchester had one servant, it's claimed, whose sole duty was to keep fresh-cut flowers constantly in the myriad of gorgeous vases which adorned the great mansion. Mrs. Winchester did leave her strange spirit house. Often she rode into San Jose in her Victoria, drawn by beautiful teams of horses wearing solid gold mounted harnesses, or in her splendid modern limousine. But never did she alight from the vehicles. The servant would invariably enter stores to make her purchases, while Mrs. Winchester would sit unnoticed at the curb. The aged woman's life is said to have known the greatest laughter as a result of a series of love letters emanating from a San Jose youth who showered upon Mrs. Winchester his professions of love. The letters were never answered, it is said, but afforded the lonely woman a keen diversion. The soul of Mrs. Winchester, friends say, must have felt the touch of romance, for often, the stories go, she found her way to the balconies or open windows to listen to the songs or talks of lovers who came to woo her servants in the gardens beneath. Once, it is said, her love of music caused her to forget that she was listening in, and at the end of a romantic song strung on the guitar by an adoring suitor sitting by his sweetheart, she called to him, "Please repeat." Nothing was ever allowed to interfere with the eccentric old lady's peace of mind, it is said. And once, when the neighbors a half a mile away provoked her with a night of revelry in which there was much noise, she the next day ordered the purchase at any price of the property on which the neighbors lived. A wise young realty dealer, we are told, once took advantage of this failing of Mrs. Winchester's, informing one of her servants that someone was contemplating the erection of a roadhouse on a huge tract of land opposite her home. Mrs. Winchester immediately paid a fabulous sum for the land, as was anticipated by the realtor. And so Mrs. Winchester lived in this strange, romantic spirit house, concerning which so much is said and so little actually known. A few short months ago, the aged woman requested the foreman of her corps of carpenters to lower the treads of the flight of stairs in order that she might more easily ascend them. In that simple order, one of thousands, was a note of pathos. It told of coming on of irresistible old age and the approach of death. A wheelchair finally came into play, and in this Mrs. Winchester many times a day was wheeled to the famous white satin room by her servants. But only as far as the door did the servants go. There on the threshold of the mystic room she stopped them, entering alone and remaining for hours at a time. Death ultimately came, as it must come to all, bringing to a close this strange life of lonely grandeur. In her life, her friends say, Mrs. Winchester did find happiness and a secret satisfaction in her mode of living. In 40 years of her residence in the Spirit House, the recluse never visited another home, never entered a church or a public building, nor did she ever ride upon the railroad train. But she still tore down and built again upon the strange mansion which San Jose and Santa Clara County Fold will point out as the Winchester Place. And that, groovy sound searchers, brings me to the end of our articles for this episode. These were so fun to read through. I have a whole lot more, but I can only include a couple for time's sake. This is such a fascinating location, and to see how it was perceived in the year of which she died and just a couple years later, and to see how it's still seen that way today. Things have, very few details have changed. That's truly wild to me. 100 years this house has held its reputation, as has its owner. I actually stumbled into these articles by accident a few weeks ago and just dove headfirst down that rabbit hole because it is so cool and I absolutely adore that house and I really want to visit one day. But as for today, you all can visit my social media profiles for the Old Newspaper Plus. On Instagram, you can search for Court Lorraine, that's me, or the_old_newspaper_plus. That's all words spelt out, no capitals, no space. You can also find me on Facebook at The Old Newspaper Plus. All words, again, spelt out, no spaces, no capitals. You can expect a few cool images, like I mentioned, on social media to accompany this episode. But I really don't feel like posting a whole bunch of pictures of the house, which you can find on your favorite search engine. Speaking of finding, you and your friends can find me on my podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Castbox, Amazon Music, Audible, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and on YouTube. And if you have any old newspapers of your own, or if you have a story that you would like for me to research and read about, please feel free to send me an email at theoldnewspaperplus@gmail.com. Please, everybody, remember to like, follow, and share with, anybody. For now, I'm Courtney Lorraine, continuing to bring you the old news. Bye.